The battle for the rights of families separated by the Trump administration isn't over. It began with implementing a travel ban in majority Muslim countries. Then ICE started disregarding the policy of sensitive places and amped up the tactics to detain people in courthouses, churches, hospitals, and even schools. Little by little, the administration has dismantled legal pathways to the U.S. such as temporary protected status for 6 of the 10 countries that benefit from this humanitarian relief: Sudan, Haiti, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Nepal, and Honduras. And Trump has rescinded DACA, a protection for young adults who came in the country as children before 2007. Recently, the administration announced a zero-tolerance policy that criminally processes asylum seekers. That resulted in the caging of kids separated from their parents. And all in the name of what? Safety? Security? That's what Trump sells it as, but it's really a product of racism. Trump is acting on the beliefs he's been spewing since day one of his campaign.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
So let's look over why his arguments and solutions, or lack thereof, are flawed. Mexicans aren't bringing crime. Here are some real facts. As the percent of the Latinx population in the US has doubled since the early 1990s, crime has dropped significantly. For example, from 1991 to 2016, the murder rate fell by roughly half, from 9.8 killings per 100,000 people to 5.3. Immigrants are less likely to commit a crime. One study by the Cato Institute in Texas shows that undocumented immigrants had 56% less criminal convictions compared to native-born Americans, and that gap was even larger, 85% for legal immigrants. Are they bringing drugs? We can't deny that some of the drugs coming into the US come from Mexico and other Central American countries. But what is fueling illegal immigration is the money and weapons smuggled back to Mexico. 70% of the firearms seized in Mexico from 2009 to 2014 were traced back to the US, according to a 2016 report of the Department of Justice Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And the New York Times reported that drug traffickers make $64 billion a year from US sales. Perhaps the US needs to take a closer look at its consumption patterns. For example, consider how prescription drugs made and sold in the US are a driving force for the opioid crisis. Are they even Mexican? Since 2009, the trend has been that more Mexicans are leaving the US than coming to it, according to Pew. Most border crossings are from people fleeing violence in countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. This brings me to my next point. The US is responsible for these crossings. Migrants seeking asylum from those countries aren't coming to the US because they want to. They're fleeing life-threatening situations due to corruption, drug trafficking, and gang violence. And the United States foreign policy in Central America has fueled a lot of it. Let's take a closer look at El Salvador. The US spent billions to support the military right-wing government during El Salvador's civil war from 1980 to 1992. This caused many Salvadorans to flee, and for the youth stuck in segregated communities in LA, gangs were the only community they found. The best known is MS-13, which started in the 80s and is now a transnational gang. Eventually, these gang members were deported back to El Salvador, which is now home base for Mara Salvatrucha, and are the primary reason that the country is one of the most dangerous in the world. George W. Bush granted TPS to Salvadorans in 2001, after their country was rocked by back-to-back earthquakes that killed thousands and displaced millions. The DHS is taking away that protections from the 200,000 Salvadorans living in the US because the original conditions caused by the earthquakes no longer exist. Yes, their infrastructure is better, but the country has become more dangerous in the past 17 years. To put it in perspective, homicide rates in El Salvador during 2017 were 60% higher than in 2001, and there aren't job opportunities for the residents of the country. In fact, 17% of the GDP is money from abroad. But the DHS refuses to recognize gang violence as a reason to keep protecting these individuals. Instead, they're treating victims of crime as criminals. The effect that separating and detaining children can have on them psychologically could result in radicalization that have and will make the US less safe. What we really need is comprehensive immigration reform. It's ridiculous that in my lifetime there has been no immigration reform. The last comprehensive immigration bill Congress passed was signed by Ronald Reagan in 1986. Yes, Republicans' favorite idol gave amnesty to immigrants who entered the country without proper documentation before 1982. But maybe he felt guilty for all the money he gave to a right-wing regime in El Salvador. I digress. Comprehensive reform came close in 2014 when the Senate passed a bipartisan bill that President Obama was ready to sign, but it was blocked by House Republicans. Republicans now have control of Congress and the executive branch. If they wanted to, they could make it happen. But Trump and Sessions, they don't want to solve the issue. They want to continue criminalizing people of color and feed the private prison industry, which gave them tons of money. I'm not satisfied with Trump's executive order, and neither should you. I don't expect that this administration will do anything to protect brown families, because as far as I'm concerned, their mission since day one was based on lies that are only dividing us and clouding the real issues that we face as a country. If you want this to change, support grassroots and legal organizations that are representing or advocating for migrant rights. Also, make sure to find out what your local and state representative stance on immigration is. Demand for a just reform, and vote.